2024, the Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program was created to collect and preserve the stories and experiences of Florida's veterans and to recognize the state of Florida's military contribution throughout our nation's history. Through recorded interviews, the Florida Veterans History Program Oral History Collection acts as a living archive of first-hand accounts to capture the details of military service and the voices, memories, and reflections of the Floridians who served. The Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program is operated by the Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture's Florida Folklife Program. Together, we are proud to ensure that Florida's military history is preserved, honored, and shared. My name is Julian Duncan with the Florida Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, Florida Folklife Program. Today is March 11th, 2025. The time is 10:47 a.m. I'm interviewing Michael Roehr on St. George Island, Florida. This interview is being conducted for the Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program and will additionally be submitted to the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. So good morning, Mr. Roehr.
Good morning.
To begin, can you tell me where you were born and a little bit about your childhood?
Yeah, I was born in Kansas City, Missouri in 1941. Lived with both of my parents all the time that I lived in Kansas City. I had an older brother, 8 years older, Frederick Roehr. We lived in the southwest portion of Kansas City. I went to Hale Cook Grade School from kindergarten through 7th grade, and Southwest High School, Kansas City, 8th grade through senior. It was an excellent school system and a wonderful neighborhood to live in. And our high school was rated one of the top 37 in the country back in those old days. And I also went to the University of Kansas City in Kansas City, Missouri, which is now called University of Missouri at Kansas City. Got my bachelor in science there in 1963. While I lived there, I had exciting summer jobs driving Hires root beer trucks for delivering to stores and loading mail trains at the Kansas City railway station. And had what I consider a fairly normal upbringing in a nice city. My parents are both deceased now. But
What did they do?
my father was a wholesale paper salesman, and my mother was a homemaker. And she also was a Red Cross volunteer and volunteered at the enlistment center in Kansas City for people coming into the military. So she helped a lot of them through a tough day by being the coffee and donut lady for them, and also worked at Wadsworth Hospital up in Leavenworth, where she even had a 15-minute radio show every week for the patients in the hospital.
Oh, cool. What was the radio show
Just
about?
Odds and ends. She would pick out subjects she thought were interesting, and for the most part, the people there gave feedback and they thought it was interesting, whether it was something on animals and science or something in sociology, politics, news of the era. She was just interested in a lot of things.
Well, with your mom working at the enlistment center, did you come from a military family?
No, I don't think there was anybody on her side of the family that was in the military in any recent generations. My father's side of the family, he had two brothers who served in World War II in the Army. One at a U.S. base, never got overseas. Another uncle of mine was in the Japanese Pacific Theater with the Army.
What about any of your siblings? Any of them display any interest?
No, my brother was never involved with the military.
What did he do? What does he do?
He was a lawyer, went to Rice University for bachelor's and got his JD from University of Chicago, and moved out to work for a judge in Portland, Oregon, and spent his whole career out there before he passed.
So, you went to college. Can you remind me what you studied in college?
Biology was my major. And at one time early on, probably in high school days, I thought of medical school, but I gradually realized that possibly academically and psychologically, I wasn't ready to be that deep into any given subject. So I stuck with biology with a chemistry minor, and then went on to graduate school in marine biology.
Very cool. Had you considered a military career up to this point?
No, not at all. Other than maybe when I was in grade school, liking military uniforms and things. No, it was not a career thought in the slightest to start with.
What drew you to marine biology?
The fact that I wanted a biological field and I wanted it to be associated with water. Having grown up in the Midwest, I wanted to go one direction or another to do my study and work in relation to major water. And that fell right into marine biology, biological oceanography. And my concentration was ichthyology. I was picturing being involved either in an academic situation with that or museum position, something, but that part never came to pass.
What do you? I'm not familiar with ichthyology. What is?
Oh, study of fishes.
Oh, okay, cool. So, what led you to commissioning in the Air Force? What's that process?
In graduate school at the University of Miami, where I had a graduate assistantship, I had to work full-time one semester.
And is this University of Miami in?
University of Florida.
Okay.
Yes. And it's on Virginia Key, which is the first key across a bridge from Miami proper. And so I had to work full-time, and at best was taking a minimum load of thesis credits. The draft board managed to pounce upon that, and I was called for a physical exam, and I managed to get a little delay of that, but came out 1A, and they said, "You're eligible." And I decided I better prepare, so I went to local units to see about the guard or reserve, and they were totally full. No chance of get there. I went to a recruiter for the Air Force and talked to him, and he said, "What's your situation?" And I said, "I'm in graduate school, et cetera, et cetera." He said, "Well, you could go to officer training school." And I said, "Well, I guess that's a possibility." He said, "Well, but we don't want anybody for officer training school unless you want to be a pilot or a navigator." And essentially, I knew nothing about piloting or navigating. But I said, if I'm in the Air Force, I guess that's what a person should do. So I was not a person who grew up totally fantasizing about flying airplanes and wanting to do that. I was not directed from birth toward that job, to my knowledge. But I applied, managed to ace the assorted tests, and got accepted, and had a letter that said I was going to officer training school, followed by pilot training, when the Selective Service Board said, "Report, and this day and the following day you'll be sent to Fort Leonard Wood, you'll be in the Army." I said, "But I have this letter, I'm going to the Air Force." And they said, "Are you sworn in?" I said, "No." They said, "Then we'll take you."
Wow.
And a very nice lieutenant at the enlistment center, when I showed up for my draft enlistment, looked at my letter, and he spent some time that afternoon and processed it and got me sworn into the Air Force 14 hours before I would have left for the Army.
Wow. That must have been a...
Which was the break in my life right there. That move set the pattern for everything after that, to my benefit.
Must have been a very stressful couple of days.
It was. I had come with a small bag. They tell you the stuff you could bring to Army basic training, and I would have been on a bus the next morning.
Wow.
And as it was, there may have been 300 people in the hall of people going into the service, since it was a busy time, Vietnam era. And they called my name, and they knew then was going to happen. I was going to Air Force basic training. And they called my name in this room and said, "Roehr, would you like to take your car to basic training?" At the time, I was just turned 24, and everybody else in the room was 17 through 19. And the grumbling went through of people saying, "Why does he get to take his car?" Because all these kids were leaving their car and their girlfriend and their family. And they gave me 5 days to get to San Antonio, which was comfortable. And I reported for basic training. And the sergeants in whatever office I was in at that time said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "You'll excuse me, but I thought I was in the Air Force now and you told me what to do." This way, you've got 7 weeks before your officer training starts. You can go to basic training. I thought, well, that's enlisted basic training. I don't know if, or put you on detail. I said, "What's the detail?" He says, "I think you'll be working a garbage truck, and the garbage you'll be picking up stuff in the officer training school area also, so they'll get to know you as the guy on the garbage truck." And I said, "You're trying to tell me something." I went to basic training. The 2 sergeants from my group came by once my car was parked. They picked me up and took me to lunch and said, "You're older, you've got a bachelor's degree, you're going to officer training school, you'll probably be the dorm chief." And sure enough, 65 guys, so I was one of them, but they said, "Just don't say anything." They selected me to be the dorm chief a week and a half later or so, and I ended up monitoring those 65 people alone when the sergeants would go home to their family for dinner and sleeping the night. So it was a wonderful start. Every notch of this, even though I didn't know it at the time, was to my benefit because I suddenly had to learn how to take care of 65 guys, march them to meals, do a little bit of adjustment on their behavior and attitudes. And it was a wonderful experience, actually. And I'm glad I got to do it. Plus, it gave me a better appreciation of how everybody on the enlisted side of the house in the military starts. And I think that's fair to them also to know that. And learned about military customs and courtesies, uniform stuff. So when I got to officer training school, it was a smooth, easy start. And the other guys there, with the exception of a couple of enlisted people that had been around and got into officer training, were starting all over again, learning all the new stuff. All in all, it was a very pleasant beginning.
See that. Yeah. How did you get along, in particularly in basic training with these? Sounds like mostly younger. Um,
Pretty
trainees
well.
being in a position of leadership.
The majority of them respected the position that I had been put in, if nothing else. I had a style that was not trying to be authoritative, pretty soft approach, quietly say, "You need to do this. It's for the good of all of us," etc. I've heard of other people who tried to use the loudmouth bully type approach that they might have seen drill sergeants do in movies or something, but that wasn't appropriate. As in effect, an equal with a one notch up. And I only had 1 or 2 people that tried to challenge our little system, and I finally had to write a detailed description of one fellow's actions and turn it over to the sergeants. And they showed him my opinions and discussed the fact that he would be able to restart with another basic training group from the first day, which is the one horror of basic trainees, thinking have to do it again. And he straightened out just like that, and everybody was happy.
It's interesting to hear that it sounds like you very much came in and were put in a position to formulate a leadership philosophy from day one. And I mean, did
Yes.
it continue into other leadership positions that you were in throughout your military career?
It helped in officer training school itself, and that they had a rank structure within that. I ended up at a captain level, and I guess out of a class of 400, I finished third, which got me a regular commission out of officer training school. And I know that the basic training experience helped a lot in being able to do that. And it, of course, made me appreciate the relative improvement in life situation of officer training school. Instead of 65 people on 2 floors, we took 2 guys to a room, and it was almost like being human.
Yeah, what was the training experience like in officer training school?
It was good. Quite a bit of classroom work, academics, opportunities to present verbal talks where we develop on some subject that was assigned to you, and go to the library, do some research. It was a lot of it related to being in any kind of academic environment. And our major, who happened to be our specific instructor, had a very good attitude and was knowledgeable. And there was obviously a little more freedom than basic training had been. And I found it another good experience.
Were most of your instructors commissioned officers? Did you
Yes.
train with enlisted or civilians?
There were a few enlisted things, particularly on some of the physical training, but primarily it was commissioned officers.
And these people, you mentioned one was a major. They've what was their experience like, and what kind of things were you hoping to learn from them?
It was basically just the things you had to know to survive and function in the Air Force as a commissioned officer. And I guess we were also getting an attitude of how they behaved toward subordinate people. And fortunately, as I had someone who did it in a good manner, I felt I learned from that. I heard a few stories of different people who weren't as satisfied with their instructors, but I think that's the case in many walks of life. The preparation was fairly good, I felt.
So moving on to pilot training, that's where you went. Is that?
Yes, that was the
Where was that?
next step. I went to Webb Air Force Base in Big Spring, Texas, which has long since been shut down. At the time, there were 8 pilot training bases in the United States, and each class was about 45 people, and they would, I forget, roughly 6 weeks apart. Although that was the starting point, I think they couldn't rotate that many classes through because there wasn't room. But I do remember, due to an injury, I had to change back to the next class, and the 6-week point was where I fit in. Um, I had no idea what Big Spring, Texas would be like. I had selected, everybody put in for their choice of base, but it was ended up being done on a lottery level. I picked Phoenix because, hey, it's a big city. I know what it's vaguely like. I'll try that. And it was a popular choice, but as it was, it ended up another wonderful situation. Big Spring people were very nice. The environment was perfect for the training, and it was also perfect for my side interest, which was racing motorcycles.
Oh, cool.
Which I had actually gotten into when I was in graduate school even. And that was my primary hobby for many years in the Air Force. But
how was Phoenix? What was the environment like that for racing motorcycles?
Big Spring, Texas was excellent. There were races in Odessa, Texas, and Midland, and Odessa, or in San Angelo, and became great friends with the family that owned the local motorcycle shop.
Cool.
So totally unrelated to the military, it was a pleasant place also.
Yeah.
But the flying environment and the weather in West Texas, most of the year just perfect.
So the training for, I mean, you mentioned that you flew F4s following
Yes.
pilot training. What was the training for, or what was the training? What did the training for that entail?
First of all, going to F4s out of pilot training at that time, if that was your assignment to F4s, you were a backseat pilot.
Okay.
The only people in the backseat of the F4 for the first few years I was exposed to it was two pilots. And it was a pilot systems operator, they'd called. So you were learning to fly the airplane because they had full controls in both cockpits, other than the selection of afterburner and the initial start. And most backseat pilots got about half the flying time and frequent landings. Training was almost, to me, it's thinking about any fighter style airplane. People learn how to take off, land, and fly around the airplane first, and they'll ultimately get into things like shooting the gun at a tow target and bomb range work of bombing and strafing and some somewhat elementary air-to-air combat. And it was a 6-month school. And going back a little bit, the only single-seat fighters that were available for all 8 bases graduating at the same time when I did, it was either 6 or 8 single-seat fighters available, positions that needed to be filled. And I'm pretty sure every one of those went to the number one in the class at one base or another. Not everybody wanted to fly fighters, but as a rule, the people who finished higher in the classes ended up with fighter assignments. And if you wanted a fighter, in my case, you took the backseat of an F4 since I was not number one.
You must have graduated pretty highly, though.
Well, it was, I think, 10th out of 45. It was no big shake, but it was a wonderful airplane. And trying to think of what to add to that.
It's fine. We'll talk more about flying. So what years were you in training?
The officer training school was all in 1966. Graduated from that in 67, actually. After that, I went to, right out of pilot training, would have been the backseat radar school held at Tucson, Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, to learn the intricacies of using a radar for both primarily intercepts, but everything that the radar and the systems in the airplane covered. Then standard survival school at Spokane at that was Fairchild Air Force Base, which was a week or two of assorted survival, whether it was out in the wild, living off the land for a couple of days and eating ferns and things like that, and simulated prison camp. And then following down to Homestead Air Force Base, just south of Miami, for 6 months of the training in the F4 that I talked about. And that would have been 67 going into early 68.
So pretty long period of training.
And then in 68, I went to Vietnam, to Cam Ranh Bay Air Base.
When did you receive orders for Vietnam?
It would have been somewhere in early 1968 while I was in the school at Homestead. I don't remember the precise date, but there wasn't too much warning.
How did you feel receiving the orders? I imagine you expected it.
I felt good because that's what we were training for, and that's what I was pretty sure was coming. And I had an advantage, I guess, over some people because I was single. I didn't get married for the first time till I was 40, and I know it's a lot easier to be a single guy going off to something like that than someone who's leaving behind a family. And that may have come a little later, but that's one thing I noticed once I got over there. As a lieutenant, we had multiple little additional duties. I was the mail officer, and around 9 in the morning is when the mail would start being available for me to pick up and distribute to the people in my squadron. And they'd start getting antsy. Where's my letters? And then I'd distribute the letters around to the guys, and the lounge in the squadron, the crew area, would become deathly quiet. Everybody said, the letters, this is a day of no phones, in effect. Yeah. Those letters from home were so important. And I could just feel it. I corresponded with my parents, of course, and a couple of friends I had back home, but it was nothing compared to the guys that this is their wife and their children. And that impressed me in a way more than a lot of things over there. So I felt good about going over. Others didn't, but they knew they were going to have to do it for the most part.
Just thinking about, the people staying in touch with families, and I'm thinking about it in light of both a peer-to-peer kind of relationship, but also, we talked a little while back about your basic training experiences and kind of developing a lot of leadership attributes as well. And I'm sure officer training school had some leadership training. And so what was that like from both a peer-to-peer aspect and a leadership aspect, dealing with people who were struggling with that? Is it something you all talked about, or maybe counseled subordinates with, or?
Once I got into a fighter squadron, there was a very limited number of people that as a new pilot in a unit, there weren't many subordinates. And they weren't necessarily in a counselable position with the pilots. You'd have the few people working in clerk positions, working on flying equipment, parachutes, etc. And eventually that first year I did run a small shop called Combat Reporting Office with people who were putting information on the missions we would fly each day onto IBM cards and getting them into the computer system. And so I had 2 or 3 actual working subordinates there. And I didn't find too many problems that they were having to deal with that I ended up knowing about. Our actual living areas were separated considerably. As pilots, it seemed crowded to us, but it was enclosed Quonset huts with actual air conditioning. And most of the enlisted personnel were living in raised wooden platforms with low wooden sides and a canvas tent roof and no air conditioning. So there was a different lifestyle, but I didn't have too much supervisor subordinate experience that year myself, other than the one little office. And within the group, you could tell some people were concerned about their separation from home, but each person sort of dealt with problems on their own.
Okay. What was your squadron's primary mission, or what squadron were you in?
This was, I can remember my numbers, are the 559th Tactical Fighter Squadron, the Billy Goats in Cam Bay. And it was multiple. Of course, there's close air support for ground troops, and we were in the southern part of Vietnam. And but we were also involved in interdiction in North Vietnam. It was divided into 6 what they called route packages in North, and we were working 1, 2, and 3, the southernmost. I never got to 5 and 6, the Hanoi, Haiphong area. And interdiction, stopping road traffic, bringing troops and supplies and equipment from the north to the south. And some of it would be within Vietnam, of course, because they had footholds in South Vietnam as well as their own country. And so we were frequently flying to where a forward air controller, generally a slow mover forward air controller, would find a group of troops or equipment or vehicles, and we'd bomb, strafe, etc., based on the directions of that forward air controller, usually with smoke rockets, or sometimes night they might have flares. And the most rewarding, of course, was the close air support of our ground troops in contact with the enemy. And I think I only got 75 missions north that first year, but still it was technically over the north. At that time, they had a program of if you got 100 missions north, you'd go home. There was noticeable anti-aircraft activity in the south, but it was nothing as severe as the guys were facing way up north. I saw thousands and thousands of tracer rounds going by my wings frequently when we were up there, but not the extent. I never saw a surface-to-air missile launched. They refer to it looking like a telephone pole coming up at you. And somewhere I may have had one after me, but I never saw it. And I never saw a MiG in that time. Never had any air-to-air combat on any of my tours over there. But again, close air support for the troops was the most rewarding thing. And we also had an alert system at Cam Ranh where 6 aircraft were always sitting there hoping to be off the ground in 5 minutes notice, to where you were in your flight suit, in your G suit. You could be on a bunk and try and sleep and eat in there, but you needed to be running out the door within 30 seconds of the bell going off. And,
and how often did that happen? I mean, because I'm just thinking about sort of hurry up and wait.
Since we rotated through that, getting that kind of call probably was less than 50% of the time when I was in it. But one of those calls ended up being probably the most single rewarding mission I had over there. But, it was the extraction of our troops from a place called Cam Duck. It was a forward fire base, but developed enough it did have a dirt landing strip at it. But it had a pretty heavily fortified bunker system where all the troops were, and they were getting attacked by a surprisingly large group of North Vietnamese regulars. And we got there, I think, because the first 2-ship of F4s, and there was an available forward air controller flying around, but they also had a ground air controller embedded with the people. And at one point they just said, if you see something moving, people outside, it's not us. And we were strafing extremely close to their positions and putting down napalm extremely close. And part of it, occasionally, it would look like what I remembered from cameras from the Korean War, the human wave assault type of attack. And it was scores of people that I think we were credited by the forward air controller, 150 killed by air. But it gave them the time. While we were there, other flights started coming in, and a C-130 managed to actually land at the point where we were able to build a lull and take a bunch of the guys out. A C-123 landed as the last one, got the last people out. That crew got the Medal of Honor, and the Air Force Cross went to the C-130 people. They were just extremely dangerous landing and operation. The fact that they survived was amazing. Of course, more and more fighters were coming in to help. We went back. Of course, we were out of ammunition and fuel, and we asked to go back again. They said, no, that we're rotating other people and other airplanes. You've had yours.
And You mentioned you were in the back seat for his first tour.
Yes.
What did that entail in terms of being on a mission like that? Doing?
Besides locating where you are and helping with that, it's another set of eyeballs is one of the biggest things. But when we would do a dive bomb pass, you became an oral altimeter. Okay. You cannot see the pipper, the sight glass from the rear cockpit. That's the front seaters. And you'd come up, by the way, with the statistics for I want to roll in and at this dive angle stuff with this weapon. And I say, okay, you want to set this for your mill setting. The amount of depression on the sight. So some computations you do. And then he'd judge his altitude, roll in, try to set up the dive angle that's appropriate for dropping a given ordnance. And the one thing he could do is he wouldn't have to look at the altimeter because I'd be the altimeter saying 5,000, 4,000, 3,000, ready, pickle. Pickle being pushing the button. So it was, you'd think of it somehow as a menial job, but the way the systems worked then, it did take an eyeball scan load off the guy who was trying to keep a good picture with his sight. And they hadn't developed the heads-up displays yet. The only heads-up thing was a combining glass with that sight projected on it, a circle and a few markings and another circle and a dot. And you, based on winds, if you could find out what the winds were, you could offset the dot a little bit. But that was it. It was limited as from a pilot standpoint. I was always wish I was up there.
I can't imagine doing complicated mathematical work with bullets flying, in high pressure situation like that. I mean, I guess the training kicks in.
Yeah, when you have done it, you do it when you need to do it, and a lot of it, of course, does just come automatically. Yeah. And as far as the flying, it was just through nice guys up front that you got the stick time in the back. And actually, during that year, I got a 5-ride program in the front seat with an instructor in the back, but they didn't allow us to go ahead and fly combat missions. Whether it was sort of dangling a carrot out for us.
What kind of non-combat missions would you fly?
Almost. Well, I guess we did do some escort for B-52s to get them to where they were going to drop. And frequently that was at least with my experience, it depends on what day and what people, but we didn't see too much ground fire on the times we were there, hoping to go after anybody that shot at the big airplanes. But we could escort them to wherever their straight and level drop was. Later, and it wasn't that particular year, I did also escort C-130 gunships, the AC-130. They'd be circling a target, shooting, depending on which model it was, 20 millimeter guns out the side, and some of them even ended up fixed with 105 howitzers that they were shooting out the door. And some of them might have had a 40, and we'd be looking at whoever was trying to shoot at them and then roll.
Well, you flew, you told me 470 combat missions?
Yeah, that was over a period of 2.5 years, which a lot of people didn't get over there that much.
Yeah. Well, what was the typical, I mean, that seems like an extraordinary number to me. What was the typical number of combat missions?
I don't know if there was any standard, sort of when you were there, how many missions were being flown and how the rotation in the squadron worked, or did you fly every other day, or I don't think I could come up with a good opinion on numbers like that. I do know because of scheduling, our commander, the squadron commander, was able to break up the 4 flights within the squadron into 3 flights working and then a week off for the fourth one, and that would rotate. So each month, roughly, each flight would get a month off. And if you could find a way to do something else and travel, obviously we would get each combat tour, you'd get an R&R for a week, and it was a beautiful program that got people to places. And I went to Hong Kong on my official one, but then I learned that if you have the time off and there are empty seats on an R&R plane, you can get one and go. So I spent a week in Australia by calling up and finding a vacancy, and I mentioned it to other people. In fact, I think 6 of us went together. One of those, there were that many empty seats. So it showed there were enough breaks in your schedule that you weren't flying every day, every other day necessarily, and a smart and thoughtful commander could develop a way to allow you to really use your time off, and then you'd come back and fly heavily.
Interesting. Where all did you go through R&R? And
Oh, well, I started off early getting to Bangkok, Thailand. I was there ready to go to work. A couple of days later, the fellow who ended up my front seater for over half of my missions, that you weren't locked to a given front seat pilot, but there was a crewing system in general. And the commander said, "We don't need you quite yet. Why don't you take a trip somewhere for a few?" He said, "Okay, but I'm going to take my Gib, guy in the back." And they said, "Well, we don't necessarily want to give him." I said, "Well, I don't need to take a trip." So we had a good relationship right away because I got an immediate vacation to Bangkok. We had a good time together, and that was a good way to form a good flying crew too. And but then I got to Hong Kong, Australia, Tokyo, Taipei, Philippines, where we did go through, before we even started going to your base, I went through jungle survival school, which was a good school in a sense, but it was fairly soft survival. You weren't in any long-term deprivement situations.
Kind of like the school you'd been to prior to.
Yeah, you had to work a little harder at the one in Washington.
Yeah.
To eat and feed yourself for a few days, or be in a pretty strict prison camp situation. There, we learned how to cook some stuff in the jungle, and in trying to hide from people in the jungle, we'd try to see if we could keep the native Negritos who were hired to find us from finding us, but they knew every trick in the book. But it was a little bit of a vacation too. But traveling in Asia was a big bonus of the war, and it helped people, I'm sure, mentally.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that. I mean, I'm just thinking from the perspective of, uh, higher ups implementing a program like this. Imagine adrenaline, experiences in combat would be pretty intense. I mean, do you feel like there was a measurable impact on performance and blowing off steam? And
Yeah, I guess even without getting the trips, which was the super bonus, people did pretty well because our living compared to what it could have been was so good over there. And my squadron had built their own, I think the term was party hooch. It was a bar that people would have been happy to have had back home in their neighborhood. And everybody kept a good attitude, happy, and worked well and played well together. Oh, plus at Cameron Bay, we had one of the most beautiful beaches in the world. And if you weren't flying that afternoon, you had a pickup truck loaded up with people. I sent home for my mask and flippers because diving was so good around there. And so it really wasn't like being in a war zone in World War II, living in trenches, or World War One. Anybody who'd been through a really tough situation would think it was paradise what we had. But
I always like to ask about humor. Just fascinates me. Were there any jokes that you can think of that might have been like pilot inside jokes or specific to that situation that y'all told? That you can remember?
I can't. 'Cause I'm not too good at remembering jokes anyway. But uh, I'm sure there were some probably morbid jokes going around when you're dropping napalm and stuff. You end up with terms like crispy critters and stuff that's fairly bad taste approach at humor. I think I had one little poster on my locker that was just a buzzard sitting there saying, "Patience, hell, I'm going to go out and kill something." And but it was a vulture reference, but it kind of applied to the fact of what we were doing. But I don't remember too many good or really funny examples. So.
Oh, those are interesting though. I mean, I feel like you see that with I don't know, I'm just thinking of veterans of other conflicts or even like EMS and all, like kind of dark humor as a coping.
Yeah, I'm sure that it's there. I wish I could remember more details, but it is something that people do because they realize what they're doing is not what you want to have as an ordinary thing. Um,
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, you went over there a couple of times, right? Can you?
I was a year in Vietnam, and maybe just 6 months through the year, roughly, they put out an offer and said, if you would like to upgrade as soon as you leave here from the back seat to the front seat, which I certainly did, and I think the majority of the guys did. I don't know what percentage took advantage of the offer. They said, volunteer in advance for another year in Vietnam somewhere in F4s, and we'll put you right into F4 front seat training. And I jumped on that immediately, and I think several other guys did. So I knew before I ever left there that I was going off to the same 6-month school I'd been through before, but in a different seat. And I liked that idea. Didn't care how long. Well, I knew I'd be home at least 6 months. And so as I left, and I forget how much gap I had, I ended up going to MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa and stepped right into that base's version of the same school I'd gone through in Homestead. And ended up slightly delayed getting through that because I had an aircraft accident that year on a training mission where a external wing tank didn't feed and had an instructor in the back seat. And it was, yeah, the mission we were supposed to go on, but when the tank didn't feed, that kind of stopped. That part was a strafing practice air to air where they tow a target on a wire way behind another airplane and he's turning so that you're not shooting at him also. But in that case, we came back, just declared a precautionary landing, advising we had a problem because it puts you somewhat out of balance. You'll be trimmed to hold that heavy wing with one empty fuel tank on one side. But again, it's pretty minor and wouldn't be considered any. And as I got close to the field and was coming across Tampa Bay, landing to the northeast, another aircraft came in to do an overhead pattern. Ours was straight, and that's, of course, flying downwind, coming around on a base turn. From up on his downwind going that way, the tower told him to go around. He had an aircraft coming in with a problem. No response. Told him around here, no response. Around here, no response. All of a sudden, he was right in front of me. He didn't see me. And I thought it was still going to be okay, frankly, even though he did. But I caught his jet wash very, very close to the ground, his wake turbulence from his airplane. And I think part of it was they finally told him, are you going around or not? There's an aircraft right there. He said, oh, me? And he did an afterburner go around and changed, I think, attitude quickly, which increases the wake. And of course, I went that fast because there's an extension of the land there that they built out into the water. So you're down very low, close to the runway beginning. And all of a sudden, I was in the water. I just, uh-oh. And I'll swear nobody could have come out of it. Obviously, I wasn't an experienced F-4 test pilot. Maybe a human could have, but I could. And the water was only about 6 feet deep, and it ripped off both of the wing tanks, the radome and the radar, and a bunch of rocks along the shore that ground the bottom off the airplane. Went airborne for 600 feet, splatted down in the grass, and slid up almost to the runway. And at one point in there, I was just waiting for little shades to come down. There's nothing I could do. I was just, you're not going to survive this. And all of a sudden I stopped, looked around. Hey, looked down, my feet were in the grass. The rudder pedals were still hanging there. And I think my feet must have been up on them, but they dropped off finally. Sprained my ankle. And this is a phony tooth that it apparently ran it. That was the only well, the ankle sprain didn't last. That was the only lasting injury. The back seater was ejected accidentally. When the rocks were grinding at the bottom of my seat, it broke the rail logs, pushed my seat up, and when the front seat is actuated in an F4, the back seater has to go first. If you bail out in F4, the front seater can pull his handle and the back seater goes, then he goes. He doesn't even need to touch anything. So anyway, he ejected, sort of flying half sideways, got a parachute, one swing, stopped, walked away. That was the real good thing about it, is he was okay. I think he had a sore back for a week or two. And a guy came running out from the quick check area at the end of the runway for people who were taking off and helped me out of the cockpit. And I was still kind of slow. And an ambulance came out. They had a priest in the ambulance. They always have one of those to give last rites. And so we just chatted on the way.
Yeah, those kind of training accidents, how often would you say it happened? I'm sure there was something you were aware of.
During that year, there was one other in a different class, but it was a guy I had known from somewhere. He temporarily may have lost both engines before getting to the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, landing from the Gulf, going to the east, northeast. You're probably familiar with the area, I don't know. The nice bridge. And he thought he was not going to get over that bridge, and he told the backseater to eject, and the backseater ejected, and darned if he didn't hit his head some way on separation or something, he was killed. The guy got the engine started, got over the bridge, and landed, which he didn't hurt the airplane. He was okay, but mine destroyed a brand new F4E, but his got a person. But that's the only ones I knew of in that short time frame. And that cost me a position in my class. I had to be inspected medically, and you waste time. So I was just set back a class and finished up with a different training squadron. So I've babbled a long time about that one, but
How long did it put you out for? I guess probably.
I forget how many weeks between classes, because they had 3 or 4 squadrons on that base of training, but precisely I don't remember. I know I was idle for a while. And anyway, finished it up and got an assignment to Ubon Air Base in Thailand, which, that was a much nicer situation from a living standpoint. I don't know whether you want to get into that approach. The missions there were primarily the interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or all the different things they called that. So we did a lot of missions over Laos. We had gotten a number over Cambodia the first year also, at a time when there were some questions about operating in Cambodia, I think politically. But big part of our stuff out of Vuban, though, was Laos. And I was in the 497th Tactical Fighter Squadron, the Night Owls. So the majority of our missions were at night. And we would work with forward air controllers who would have flares and stuff to put down. And then they developed within the Night Owl Squadron the Owl Fax, which night forward air controllers, where we would go up with special pods where we could drop the marking rockets or drop flares that would go down and give you a ground point. And we were looking for the targets. And we had aircraft with Loran, which was much better than the inertial navigation system most F4s had. And we could also drop parachute flares and call in other flights, Air Force ground attack flight, Navy. And we also had some other regular ordnance, so we could drop stuff of our own. But that was a sideline of our squadron.
So it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, one of the major differences in these night flights versus daytime flying is you're doing a lot more scoping of your own targets.
Yes.
As opposed to the...
And sometimes we'd have stuff that was found by AC-130s, and they could find a way to talk us in or mark them and put different types of ordnance on than they could. We also did fly escort for AC-130s at night. And that one little interesting thing on the side, one of the C-130 guys had I guess it was a 40 millimeter that exploded, something with the breech, and injured their gunner, and they had to depart. So we were no longer. Years later, sitting at the bar in the base in Washington State, I don't know why I can't think of the name of it, but around Tacoma, I mentioned that incident when something came up about AC-1. The guy said, "That was me." And I guess it must have been an all ranks bar, because he was an enlisted gunner at the time. And but it was a different world living in Thailand. Of course, we could, anytime you weren't working, you could go off base, whereas in Vietnam we couldn't go off base. And Thailand was a wonderful place. I bought a motorcycle and put 10,000 miles on it during a combat tour.
Wow.
Now, I was the only officer on base with my private conveyance. There's a base with thousands of people on it. I just can't figure, why waste that part of your life when you can go do something neat.
Yeah.
I just toured all different directions into towns and cities, villages, find dirt roads, and I sort of mentally mapped out where I could buy gas. And I had some service stations were 2 or 3 55-gallon drums with a hand pump, but I knew I could get fuel there. And I was pretty used to riding motorcycles, but getting into villages where they hardly would ever see a foreigner, and just meeting people, they were all so friendly and so polite. And I had a pointy talkie book where I could point and say, "This is what I'm saying." They'd flip through it and say, "This is what we're saying." And took pictures. I remember taking pictures of a family that lived on a little grass hut by a rice field. And it was a man, woman, pretty young, with a baby. That's when I had gotten a Polaroid camera. And I started giving people pictures of themselves who never had pictures. And they were very happy. Just, you could tell they were overjoyed at something different that they weren't able to go do, because the difference in life, it's seriously primitive in some of those places. Some of the little villages are more organized and have their own Buddhist temple and fairly decent raised thatched roof houses. They'll have a school and frequently pass lines of kids in little uniforms with blue pants or blue skirts and white shirts. If I just rode by, every time they would all stop and show respect to the adult human being that's going by. And so good, when I went back to the same base for 6 months later, 6-month tour later years, I rented a pickup truck and put another 10,000 miles on that and started taking the other guys out in the truck. It had rear-facing seats and a canopy, and I could go with 8 people and take them out and show them that life does not stop at the fence of an air base. And to me, that was as much of an accomplishment as what we were supposed to be doing over there. And it added a lot to the tour.
How was the food?
At Cameron Bay, it was mess hall food, acceptable, but would get boring, which is a hard thing to explain if you also can run around people who have to eat the same thing every day of their life. So sometimes it got to the point where if we could get a pallet of sea rations, we'd use a hot plate in our room and garlic and other spices and turn sea rations into something that's better than what the mess hall had. So that was Vietnam. In Thailand, it was somewhat better.
Did you try local foods when you were around?
There wasn't in Vietnam, no. In Thailand, yes. It was constant weird little cafes, open front places, and I can remember eating one with about 14 of the little hot Thai peppers in it. I ate them all up, and my hair was sweating even. And I watched the people in the kitchen looking around the corner. But I was enjoying it, but they were laughing at the foreigner being overheated. But never got sick. I think I was just boosting my immunities as I went along. And it was a wonderful thing. I love Thai food anyway. This was serious Thai food.
So how many, just to kind of get an idea here of my own sake, so you mentioned going back to the same base in Thailand for a different tour. What was your total number of tours in Thailand?
3 tours, a year, and half a year, so 2.5 year total over there. And that's what builds up the count of missions, is just being there a lot. And that was the only foreign assignment I've ever had. Everything else was in the United States, other than 2 or 3 week temporary tours to Norway and Denmark and Germany. But the third one, the 6-month, I went over, our squadron went together. We traveled as an entire fighter squadron to pick up the airplanes that a departing squadron was leaving. And then the war officially ended, where they called it a war, on the 15th of August, 1973. Now, they still had junk going on, and you probably remember that extraction from the top of a building in Saigon and clear up in 75, but the war was over. My number 2 man flew the last combat-loaded takeoff of the Southeast Asian conflict, the official conflict. It was supposed to be the wing commander. He wanted to be the last guy. He had a TV crew ready, and we were the flight ahead of him, and we had a maintenance problem on number 2. We just had a 2-ship. And while we were getting it fixed, he got antsy about not getting off, because if you didn't take off with that combat load at the specific time, you were canceled and your war was over. Well, he took off about 2 minutes early. They got my guy fixed. We quick took off after he did, about 30 seconds earlier. And actually, I had an angry wing commander. He had his press conference all lined up. They didn't have an interview or a press conference when we got back. It's kind of funny. We dropped our bombs there was a bomb drop limit too, and it was either an hour and a half or 2 hours after the takeoff cutoff. We dropped them after an hour or so. I think they were having trouble even finding target. We got a fact that put us in on something, but I'm not sure what it was. And came back, and just that was it. No fuss, no big issue. The cameras vanished. I knew a fellow I'd known in previous F4 training who'd switched to A7s, Lonnie Ratley. He dropped the last official bomb of the war. He said he knows he dropped it legally, but he doesn't know for sure if it hit the ground before or after the war was over, which starts getting into silliness. I'm sure the people underneath the bomb didn't really care whether it was supposed to be there or not. But that's some of the stuff that goes on with politicians running wars.
Yeah, I mean, was it like the Warrens at this specific time on the
Yes.
just drop it?
And the last base, and I forget how long Lonnie Ratley said he'd been airborne, or where he came from even, and he might have taken off before we did, or perhaps his base had a different quitting time than ours. That I can't be positive of. But I think he was before ours, is when I say I flew the last, or my wingman flew the last late takeoff, but I couldn't bet on that one. But it's just a little anecdote, I guess.
Yeah. So 68 was your burst.
Yes.
Tour. What were the years for you?
68, 69 for that one. The next one was 70, 71 at Ubon. I was home in the States all through the year 72, which included a fairly active year over there. The guys, I think there was Operation Linebacker and some other stuff. They stayed busy even without me helping them. And then our squadron was called to be a replacement one in spring of 73, and that's where we finished our work in August of 73. And flew all the airplanes home across the Pacific, stopped at Guam. Well, it was neat. My backseater at the time was a Guamanian. He was the first Guamanian Academy graduate from the Air Force Academy, the first Guamanian navigator in the U.S. Air Force. And he was my backseater, just a super guy. And actually, even his wife and about 4 or 5 other wives in our squadron found out they could get together, and they came over and lived in Ubon, Thailand in a hotel. So half a dozen guys had their wife there with them during a combat tour, which was a little weird in the sense that puts some pressure on a squadron commander, for instance. If some guy gets lost, he's got a wife on his hands.
Yeah.
Now, that's what's shaky, but we only lost one guy out of our squadron that year, and he happened to be one of them that didn't have his wife over there. Again, I'm going off on tangents, but my Guamanian navigator was a really super guy, and he contacted his family. And when the whole squadron landed on Guam for refueling, reloading, rest, his family set up a big Guamanian luau, I guess, whatever they would call it there.
That's cool.
And we had a super celebration there. And then flew back, stopping at Hawaii and which base in California, I don't remember, and then on to North Carolina. So it was a 4-hop trip with a lot of air refueling. And air refueling was important on a lot of our missions, particularly going north back in the Vietnam era, to get enough time to get up there, do something, and get back. Times we would refuel before and after. Or if you couldn't get to the tanker, stop at Da Nang, which was way farther north. So got lots of air tanker refuelings through the years in the F4.
Can you describe the refueling process?
Well, first of all, by controllers, if they're available, and the built-in radars in the aircraft, you find the tanker. And as a rule, it'll be 2 airplanes, sometimes 4 airplanes, and some occasions 6 airplanes coming up on a tanker, and you're just spaced in whatever formation you're in along the side. And when they say they're ready for a specific airplane, you flip a switch that opens a little door behind, in the F4 case, behind the rear seater's head, and just fly into position. And there are some guidance lights on the bottom of the C-135 that help you get to the right spot. And of course, you're in radio contact with the boomer who's laying on his belly, controlling his end. And you just stabilize. And of course, formation flight is the heart of flying fighters to start with. We may not do routines like the Thunderbirds and the Blue Angels, but all those basic things I even mentioned among the training in an F4. You do a lot of formation and learn, and pilot training itself, basic pilot training, is how to fly close to an airplane, stay there, and not hit it. And I feel it almost every day when I drive still. I can tell if you're following somebody. I just, without thinking, if I want to keep that distance, I've often thought, I wonder if the person I'm following, and sometimes you get an erratic driver, and every now and then I'm not a tailgater, but I've wondered if some people, well, I want more separation, and they'd go. And it was just, my mind says, do it. But again, off on a tangent, but formation flying is the critical part of air refueling. You've got to be super stable and just minuscule movements of the stick, because if something happens, you have to break off. That obviously the boom will pull out quite easily if you put a little pressure on it. But it's so important, you don't want to lose that connection, and you're really deep in concentration. It gets to be about the only thing you're interested in.
Would that be dangerous?
The potential is there, but the good thing is super training. Everybody really has been trained. Now, there are guys who are better and more steady than others by tiny amounts. And I've flown with some leaders who are a bit too jerky and don't make it easy, but that's probably a problem that can be worse than a guy that can't handle what's happening on the wing. On one time coming back from Europe, I had to refuel, I think, 19 times because I had, again, a tank that wouldn't feed in the airplane. This was in 105s. And I would either have to divert to Greenland or Iceland, or for a while refuel every 5 minutes. Everybody else is just relaxing out there on the wing, beautiful day, and I was back refueling just to keep enough fuel usable in the airplane that I could continue to the next option. Jeez. And we finally got from, that may have been the one from Norway to we dropped off in a New York airport that you don't use too much, and the other guys went elsewhere. But refueling is critical. It allows missions to happen that couldn't otherwise, and it's very important. And it shows why formation is important.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wanted to go back a little bit to a couple of questions, just before I forget them. You had mentioned a while ago that you went on a trip with you called him your guy in the back. Is that your weapons systems officer you're referring to?
Yeah, when it started off being a PSO, or pilot systems officer, and finally they decided to put navigators back there, which was a reasonable decision. They didn't actually need another pilot back there. And so that became the weapons systems operator, or WSO. For a while, there were both. And some of them were starting to get a little bit on the bitter side. They couldn't get another assignment that they wanted. And so they were in the back, the same as the navigators were in the back. And when they were blended, there was a little bit of resentment on the few pilots that were left. Why can't I get out of here? Of course, you can't always have a slot available for everybody at the right time, but they ultimately did the job, and we let them fly so much that they became pretty good pilots anyway. I when I switched to F-101s in the Oregon Air Guard, they had controls in the back of the 101B, and the navigator, well, different ones that I flew with, I let them fly as much as they could, and even got some of them to where they could land it. And two of them went off, logged enough time way, and ended up airline pilots. They were able to get credit for their time on that airplane. I think they may have squeaked the rules a bit, but they were good pilots nonetheless. So
Another thing I was thinking about is you had mentioned a couple times, something stood out to me from just a couple things you said. Um, you mentioned meeting this gunner in a bar who had been involved in an incident you talked about. You had mentioned knowing the person who flew the last
oh
convocation.
yeah,
All these, and I'm just curious if like, I mean, I guess my suspicion is that the community of people doing what you do is probably pretty small. Is
in a
that
way it is compared to the rest of the world. Obviously, they're particularly with the Vietnam era, they were training. If you have 8 bases putting out 45 pilots, there's 300 and some guys coming every several months into that business, but it's still not a huge community. And you do meet people you've known elsewhere, switching bases, talk to somebody and mention some names. And say, oh, yeah, he's right over there. And it's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah.
It's there is a camaraderie of people. I wish I could remember more of the names, but if I have a genuine memory problem, it's names. Um, is why I try to keep as many squadron rosters and stuff in my files in there so I can go back and refresh myself or find a name if I can picture a face in an incident and put a name on it. Uh, that's important to me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you ever had an experience where you run into somebody just out in the world and find out you either knew them or knew someone that they knew, or is that something that happens?
I'd have to think back a little bit if that completely separated from any of the logical connections. I'm pretty sure it would have happened, but it's hard to separate from something the other. No, we did have a reunion of our pilot training class, and a big percentage of us ended up in Las Vegas together one time.
Cool.
But
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I always found that interesting about the military is a big organization or a big conglomerate of organizations, really. But these fields can be very very small and tightly connected sometimes.
yes, having the squadron system when you're in a tactical squadron in the Air Force, the bulk of people are the flying officers. You've got associated enlisted personnel in the unit, like I mentioned, that work on life support equipment and whatever uh, clerking duties need to be done. But number wise, most of those things are handled by other branches on the same base. So in that squadron, it's mostly the pilots and navigators. And so that does keep you in a tighter unit of the same type of people. I did see some that I'd known, some briefly and some a little more, one with Federal Express, uh, because with the number of military pilots they picked up, some of them had been in tactical fighters. And
Yeah, well, I did want to ask. We'll maybe start talking about the next part of your career, but I did want to ask about coming. What was your kind of homecoming experience or your homecoming experiences? What were those like
Oh,
for you?
one good thing for me, I guess, is I never experienced any of that negativity that you hear so much about. I never had a crowd of people at an airport chanting at me or saying anything negative. I always came into either quiet situations or was being met by somebody I knew anyway, and there weren't, I never experienced whatever that protest attitude was personally. So
Did you know anyone
it,
who did?
I don't think so. I don't remember anybody talking about it or seeing it. Maybe it's we weren't being targeted by the groups, perhaps. We might have come home in smaller groups, whereas maybe they were targeting where they knew a whole plane load of people was coming or
Yeah.
thing. So I got none of that. My coming home was always just pleasant. Not to mention my departures. I had an aunt in California drove me to the base to get on a plane after I'd flown out to visit her because that's where I was leaving from. And I think another of the tours, my brother dropped me off because we were down while he raced his car at one of the California racetracks. And so and coming and going was fun for me both all the time. So
Good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. So after leaving Vietnam, what was your next assignment?
okay, since the squadron came back to North Carolina at Goldsboro, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, so I was just back where I had been stationed anyway. And then I started looking for future things. And as a additional duty there, I was working in the wing headquarters on inbound and outbound assignments of flying personnel. If certain, I think, major or more ranks, they knew exactly what squadron guys were coming into or not, but it was my job to balance. Here came half a dozen pilots, which squadron needs them? And if nobody made any big claim toward a person or something, I'd just say, hey, you go to this one, you go to this one, just to keep them balanced in personnel and level of experience and training. It, in a way, seemed like a funny responsibility for just a line captain, but it was a way to get it done. So I was always looking for what's available and letting people in the squadron know what assignments were available. So I was constantly talking to Tactical Air Command headquarters assignments. They said, hey, Mike, can you find somebody that might be interested in flying 105s? And I said, huh. And I asked, where would that be and how? I said, well, it'd be 105 Wild Weasels at George Air Force Base, California. And I knew that that's where a major at a different office just down the hall had just come from. So I said, let me call you. Went down, talked to the agent, said, hey, I was talking to people at assignments at TAC. I said, did you fly 105s before? And he says, who wants to know? He had different ideas. He had done his 105 assignment. I think he liked it, but now he was getting into more of the management end. And he ended up a general. But he just stopped for a minute. He thought somebody was trying to get him back to that old assignment, and that wasn't his career goal plan. And I guess I was less directed than his attitude. Why I'm not a general. Anyway, he told me all about it. It sounded good. I went back and said, I've got somebody that wants that job. I said, who? I said, me. He says, oh, okay, you got it. And that was the only thing I've dealt with to where I could actually pick one that directly and get it. And that was a very enjoyable job. That turned into a few months of training in the F-105 basic aircraft at McConnell in Wichita, Kansas, which everybody in my family was from Wichita except me originally. And so I had aunts and uncles and cousins there. And the airplane was just interesting. I could fly the F-4 one day and the 105 the next day and enjoy each one equally. They were very different. But
what were the similarities and differences between them?
the F-4 was more maneuverable. You could turn tighter. Had a lot more air-to-air potential, whereas the 105 was not an air-to-air airplane at all. It was built for high-speed, very low altitude ingress into foreign countries with a nuclear bomb. It was originally developed with one big bay and a plunger that was kind of like the shaft of a gas station lubrication lift, and the doors would open and would punch that bomb out into the airstream with a huge hydraulic force, and then you'd break away because it was a nuclear bomb. That was the original thing for the airplane. Is why it was fast and didn't have to be fighting other airplanes. But they dreamed up the Wild Weasel job way back, starting with 100s, of putting in a bunch of radar reception gear so that they could locate enemy radars that launch missiles and pinpoint them and destroy them. So that was the mission. The airplane was just fun. Of course, all of our trainers in Wichita were two-seaters because that was the trainers, and all the Wild Weasels were made out of the two-seaters because they needed two people to do the job. And actually, they had some single seat. I got a few rides in the single seat once I was checked out to start with. It was a good training program there because they expected everybody that came in. They had made a point of that at the headquarters when I called them. You had to be some hundreds of hours in fighters to start with to even get the job. And the first time I went to, it was second time I went to the bombing range. And the first time I went on a low level, four of us sat down in there, and the instructor leading the flight, I was number two, said, "Roehr, you're leading the low level." I have never perked up so much at a flight briefing in my life to listen and say, how am I? They have books made up for the low level, which is a map system. This is going to be around Kansas and Salina, Kansas. And can you find this windmill and turn at this grain elevator? But just starting to barely get used to the navigation system they had in it, which was now it would be very archaic anyway. But this was pretty much time, speed, and distance leading a four-ship. And that, training-wise, I'd have to say that was the most demanding mentally thing that ever happened to me. And it was a smart instructor. He said, we'll see if these guys can do what they're supposed to be doing.
So these are sounds like considerably more difficult to fly if you have to have the F4 time on.
Yeah. And ended up getting them there. It was 10 seconds off at a specific IP, they call it, the something point, initial point. And that 10 seconds is not too bad. And then he took over and led us into the range process for dropping our bombs. But
this is live, like a live run.
The bombs were 25-pound practice bombs.
Okay.
That's what we used entirely in stateside. They have a hollow thing where they put a white smoke charge in, and you'll see a big puff of white smoke when it hits. I've got one of them upstairs, in fact, without the smoke part, just as a souvenir. And that and strafing. And the gun, I think, looking over these questions, there was something about not having a gun in some cases. In the F4C, we had a gun, but it bolted on the bottom. And it had actually a bigger ammunition capacity than the F4E that had an internal one finally. But it was a little harder to keep it in tune with your gun sight. Just took more adjustment on the part of ground people. But we did have strafing in all the F4 missions, or most of them as well. But, well, go ahead.
Well, about this time, I'm just curious about going back to kind of the beginning of this interview. You mentioned you haven't really considered flying or the military or anything like that. Is this around the time you decided to make it a career when you've done your service in Vietnam? You're and you stayed in for quite some
Yeah.
time. I mean, it's about that time you kind of figured out
Yeah.
what you love.
It was early on. I probably figured I wanted to keep doing it as soon as I was training for the front seat. Um, and figure my initial commitment, I think, would have been 5 years or something after officer training school anyway, but I wanted to stick around. Um, I also wanted to try different things. And even though I had briefly shopped with the people, I think I'd mentioned in St. Louis, Missouri, and Atlanta with 105s and F4s, I really wanted to go to Oregon because my brother lived in Oregon, in Portland. And I honestly think I got a little bit of help because one of the judges he'd worked with a lot was also a general in the Oregon Air Guard. And I think it got me my paperwork put in front of somebody at least to start with. And they had a vacancy. And that's when I decided I don't need to stay on active duty to keep doing this. And so I went up there, really enjoyed it.
What um what were the, I guess, similarities and differences, but really the differences between flying for active component and the National Guard?
It's almost hard to say. At the time I went through it, we had probably maybe less, I'm going to say less TDY deployments, except we had them anyway. Really wasn't too much difference other than I went into a lot of alert barn sitting. That was definitely different, of just burning up a lot of days not flying but working and being paid. The hours, I guess, total per year could be less of flying.
And I think you mentioned you were in an AGR position, so you were full time.
That was the end of it. The
Okay.
last, I'd forgotten how that term works. I got a whole bunch of active duty days when I was a part-time guardsman. But from when I started in 79 through maybe 85, the first 6 years in Portland, I was technically just a guardsman because I had to find another source of medical. I actually bought medical insurance. And of course, that picked up again when I went to Klamath Falls finally to run that little OLED unit. I was back on AGR and got back fully on the medical plan. Um, Another thing that helped me get the job, by the way, is I did spend 11 months at Seymour Johnson when they needed a body to fly the C-131 for, they had actually two of them. One of them was a general's plane for the numbered Air Force. And so for 11 months of my life, I didn't fly fighters. I flew the C-131, which there actually was called a T-29. And they were mostly had been revamped from being navigator training planes that had been in California, hauling people. Had 18 seats in the back, and I had some silly thing from Seymour to one of the Army bases and up to Langley, Virginia. And that gave me propeller experience and two-engine experience where the engines weren't right together. If you have an F4 or a T-38 certificate for FAA, that's two-engine centerline thrust, which is different than thrusting out there. So I got a rating out of that. And it also got me a better shot at the job in Oregon because they had one up there. And they said, well, if nothing else, you can fly this. But as soon as I got there, they needed a 101 pilot anyway. So I went through that school. And so actually I did have a little people hauling experience slipped in there.
And what kind of I don't know, people hauling? Where were you hauling people to?
Mostly from base to base on the East Coast, although occasionally we'd run to, well, I remember going to Wichita to McConnell Air Force Base for something one time and flying in a slow airplane, but still low. I learned about some weather things I'd never had to think about. They have mountain waves where wind can come rolling off a mountain, be very strong as you're heading toward the mountain, even if you're up. And if you're on autopilot, you're getting actually slower and slower and slower over the ground. And just a whole different planning you had to do with that type of airplane. Plus, like on the trip to Wichita, one engine was so old we burned something like 50 gallons of oil on that trip on one engine.
Wow.
They had an oil tank on each engine and a spare oil tank. And we drained all the spare into one side and then had to refill it when we got there. But small problems, but altogether different than the life of a fighter pilot.
Yeah. Well, I do want to ask a little bit about, and you mentioned this, working in uh, for the guard doing I'm all out of order here. Here we go. Ordering for the guard doing the alert missions. I mean, this is 1980s, probably heightened
Yeah.
tensions. I mean, what's going on in the world that kind of do or
It's hard to remember the details of those years from a standpoint of news.
yeah.
I just know we always knew the potential of, I think they were having some probes with Russian bombers up in Alaska, but that was, of course, a different base that had to deal with that. We were so far down in northern Oregon that our coverage area was, of course, Washington, maybe a touch of southern Canada, and on down into California, and then southern California you could pick up stuff. But things just didn't come our way. They weren't testing the borders that close to the continental United States. And we never had much time when there was much concern. We had, of course, an old airplane for 2 years in the F-101B, which, by the way, I forgot to mention the biggest difference between the F-4 and the 105 is the 105 was very pleasant, very fast on the ground. If the F-4, you could feel comfortable flying along at telephone pole level. With the 105, you could feel comfortable flying at fence level. Just had to remember if you had a wing tank under there, or a belly tank.
Extremely low.
I mean, serious low. And all my career in the Air Force, I enjoyed serious low-level flying, which I continued with my own airplane. But the 101, no, the F-4 anyway, a little bit more sensitive in pitch. The 101 way more sensitive in pitch. Some guys, backseaters that I flew with when I got there, weren't used to flying low at all because nobody wanted to get to work near anything low. And I still, within the limits of that airplane, didn't mind getting down on the water or the land. And some of them, I'm getting a little nervous back here. Okay, you don't want to scare somebody. So, but that was the 101's limitation. Otherwise, it was pleasant to fly. My only incident with it, I got hit by lightning once. It shocked me through the throttle handles, the control stick, and shocked the backseater who was fiddling with the radar. Left a bunch of pinhole marks the whole length of the airplane on the outside, little black spots. Didn't knock out any systems, didn't hurt us other than a minor shock. And you don't think of Oregon being a lightning area, but it nailed us.
Wow. Does that happen periodically, or is that more?
I've had very little of. Had one lightning strike with an F-4. I think if that was on an escort for B-52s, which is usually kind of a, compared to what we normally do, a boring mission, but they directed us in for a combat sky spot, they call it, where it's radar controlled and you're flying in the weather, and they tell you when to drop the. It was so good that they could blow up bridges that way. But they drove us into a thunderstorm one time, and the F4C had that IR dome below the radome, a little, they called it dog pecker or something, hanging down, and it blew that off, but it didn't affect us any. But it is a problem, but it's rare.
Well, thinking about this period, you mentioned incursions aren't really the U.S. airspace aren't really happening where you're at. Did you see
Right.
any kind of uptick in, I don't know, maybe tensions or maybe in sort of just general preparedness or readiness after in 1983 after the Korean Airlines flight was shut down? Is that something that affected you all's job?
I don't remember feeling that there was any effect. If it was, it's escaped me now, because I don't think there really came any noticeable differences in what we were doing or how we were doing things.
Mm.
Um, if at the time we thought the odds were up that we'd get scrambled on something, I don't remember.
How long did you spend in the National Guard?
Oh, 9 years, I think, roughly. Roughly, say, 2/3 of it at Portland Air Base and the rest at Klamath Falls. While I was still stationed out of Portland, we would fly to Klamath Falls, sometimes with the airplanes, and then leave the airplane, be 48 hours on alert. Leave the airplane, they would come down with a charter airplane, drop off the new crews, 4 guys, and we'd hop on the airplane, fly back in that. And then every so often they'd rotate the actual airplanes again. So the presence of the alert F4s down there was just 2 airplanes at a time. And they had a training unit that also occupied the base. And then the alert unit was called the Operating Location Air Defense, or OLAD. And that's who ran those 2 airplanes on alert. And it involved all the security police on the base, the maintenance for the F4s, and the command post for the base. So that was the composition of the OLAD group. And as probably get to, I ended up, when I moved down there, was taking over that unit, running what I had been doing as a pilot before. And the contracted airplane happened to be one of our pilots who was either leasing or owned his own 2-engine passenger plane. And so he got the contract to haul us back and forth.
What was that experience like commanding that unit that you was doing the
It
job
was
you've been in?
it was an interesting thing. And as far as flying while I was down there, I was still checked out, of course, and could fly the F4.
That's cool.
And well, to stay on the flying side, then they decided they needed another guy to be a target pilot because they had some T-33s there, serious old airplanes. And they sent me to T-33 school at Tyndall. Came back, then I was dual rated. That was my period of being rated in 2 radically different airplanes, the F4 and the T-33. And I'd go out and be target for some of the guys they were training, because they were training brand new guys in the F4. And so that was a different experience way, and interesting. And my very last flight in the Guard was out of Klamath Falls in a T-33. I was looking forward, I'm going to get an F4 and go out and do something to really risk my retirement. Then I realized, hey, I've got to do this, this, and this, and I've got to get to Memphis to start training with FedEx. And my last flight was yesterday in a T-33. So I went out on a 1951 airplane. But the whole 22 years was wonderful. But running the unit, in a sense, it was a very easy job because it was a small unit compared to a lot, I guess. The security policeman was already well formed. They knew what they were doing, and they had a super chief master sergeant. There's one I remember, Chief Woland, and he kept everything in order. That we had one problem that I can even remember at all. One guy went off, killed her a little bit, and he was stealing government gas to put in his own Corvette. And I had a little disciplinary situation to deal with. That was it. I mean, really good. The command post, they were very professional. They had a smaller area of things to consider. Another senior master sergeant in charge, a super guy, and I learned how to delegate immediately. And a straight master sergeant running the maintenance guys down there. They knew they all had a good deal. I let him decide how to work his work schedule, and he made kind of an unusual schedule, but it gave the majority of them what they wanted with their families and all. And it was pleasant. So it was really a pretty low pressure job because of the quality of the people and the fact they were already in established positions and self-trained, if nothing else.
Yeah,
And
you're
I
still
was,
flying a lot.
yeah.
You're administrative.
And so my deals as being a commander, besides getting a good position and stuff, I had a staff car and an office. The other part of the base, the training squadron, was somewhat bigger, but I was there, went down as a major, made lieutenant colonel. So the whole base, the senior ranks on the thing was 2 lieutenant colonels, and had a bunch of airplanes and a bunch of activity, and we got along well together, and we were off base neighbors about a block and a half apart. Um, it just was a very nice situation.
Good. So this is, and you mentioned at this point you're already in talks with FedEx and beginning your training with them.
Yes, I knew that somewhere in the future I should be doing something, and I had sort of planned ahead years back and taken a course in the flight engineer. So I was already a rated flight engineer, even though I never used it. And also went ahead and took the schooling, and this was all on VA benefits training for airline transport pilot license. So when I started talking to FedEx, I had the 2 primary licenses in the bag already, and had been sort of preparing, figuring life doesn't end with Air Force fighters. And so I applied to several airlines, and Federal Express wouldn't answer my application at first. I told a friend of mine in Nashville in the music business, guy, best friend from Kansas City. He says, "Oh, I know somebody that knows." He knew the guy that was the lawyer that helped Fred Smith start FedEx.
Oh, wow.
He said, "Send me your paperwork." I sent it to Memphis. He handed it to this lawyer. This lawyer sends it to Fred Smith. Fred Smith hands it to pilot hiring and said, "Talk to this guy." So I will, it was friends. A little bit of influence of some kind is what really saved me on that one. I would have gone with American Airlines. They were calling me back for the hiring interview. They have 3 interviews, and if they call you for the third, you've got to go insult them or something not to get hired. But when she called me for that, I said, "Oh, I've already accepted one from Federal Express." The lady, yeah, the lady, I was already in training, in fact, when they called. She said, "Oh, no wonder you don't want to go with us." Even other people in the industry knew.
Wow, yeah, sounds like it.
And that really worked out.
So at this point, about what year is this? And or do you
79. That's when I retired from the Air Force. Make sure I've got that time. Now, wait a minute. 77, excuse me. Yeah, I was getting ahead of myself. 1977. And probably late 77. By the time I was through with training and working, it would have been into 78
Okay.
with FedEx.
So you chose to
In fact,
get
you
out of
were,
the National
you
Guard at
were,
this point.
I think I'm getting a decade off on my thinking. Excuse me for that. Interpose 8 where I'm saying 7.
Yeah,
It
well,
was,
a couple
that's,
dates in here would have been quite nice.
I think I did that the other day when I was talking about years of cars. But yeah,
Okay, so 87.
yeah,
So 1987, you're getting out of the Air Force, and you're Lieutenant Colonel at this point. How many years of service did you have?
it was 22. I think my total from first swearing in to final departure on paper was 22 years plus 22 days.
And you chose to just go ahead and retire. You didn't stay.
Yes, that's
Stay.
where I debated a little bit of that.
Mhm.
They kind of hold a couple colonel slots in some guard units, I think, to rotate people through them as they might need them, and people can expect that. But traveling from Memphis, which is where I thought I would have to stay, probably working for them, FedEx, back to Portland and back, I just couldn't be a good participant.
That's understandable.
And then you balance, okay, you stay getting genuine part-time pay for so many years, and you lose that many years of genuine retirement pay, plus the work of getting there. And that wasn't worth doing.
And were there a lot of Vietnam veterans working for FedEx? I really throughout the
There were
company, but
lots of them. A
specifically.
bunch of them, of course, I did not know, but few I can at least remember picturing. Fred Olmsted was one, but and oh, it's hard to come up with the names, but it was heavily military. Started changing slowly while I was there for the 20 years, or a few months short of 20 years. But it was just a great source of people who had training and experience.
Yeah.
And I think I'd mentioned yesterday that they also would hire you later in life than a lot of airline places would, because they'd had good luck with experienced people versus relative newbies.
You think some of that has to do with Fred Smith's background?
That could well be. That you'd have to have a positive attitude about military flyers if you had been one, because
Yeah.
I don't think many people come out of it saying, "Oh, that was a terrible job." And
How long did you work at FedEx?
just almost 20 years. I retired when I hit 65. Most of the time I worked there, to be a captain, you had to quit being a captain at 60. So I was started as a flight engineer like everybody did in the 727. I upgraded to co-pilot in the 727. And then I upgraded to captain in the 727. You had an option in there to go to the DC-10, which paid more, but it would put you lower in the seniority of a given seat. And I had learned early on that where you go can be as important as how much you make. Some guys didn't have that attitude. They would carry a sandwich on a 3-day layover and whatever, rather than spend money. But people have different needs in their families. But I enjoyed it for the type of trips we had, so I stayed a little longer in the engineer seat and the co-pilot seat than I would have had to, but I didn't want to end up on reserve or flying really crummy trips. Got to be captain. Well, at age 60, at that time, bam, you either leave or revert to flight engineer, because you can't be a pilot anymore.
Interesting.
And that's changed now. It's 65. Well, I was not in between when it changed. So I said, hey, I'll be a super senior flight engineer. And they had built the total pay structure such that they were overpaying senior flight engineers. And I think it was so they could show that their average pay, there was a financial game in the way they built it, not expecting to use it. So I ended up, for 5 years, I got my first choice of trip every month. And you can't buy something like that in my mind. I just enjoyed it. I probably spent a year and a half of that going to Vancouver, British Columbia. I could have made that a second home almost. It was so nice.
Yeah, I've been out there once. I enjoyed it. What drew you to it?
Uh, it was a nice area with dozens of great restaurants. The hotel FedEx put us in had an embedded um, enterprise rental car desk,
That's cool.
and I could get a vehicle for $9.95 a day Canadian, and I had 3-day layovers there, and became good friends with the enterprise people.
Yeah, I'm picking that up that as kind of a theme throughout all this is you explore wherever you're at
Yeah,
as much as you can.
wow, Burlington, Vermont, they're Manchester, New Hampshire. In fact, I got the literature. Connie and I are going to have to go back up there. She wants to ride the Cog Railway up Mount Washington, which I did years ago. The other good thing about FedEx is those layovers, the 3 days. I got Connie a ticket on Delta to our places. She might arrive before I did frequently or after I did. She could do something for my 3 one-day in and out trips, and then we'd have our 3-day weekend. San Francisco, Portland, Maine, Baltimore, Maryland, Philadelphia, New York City. Uh, she got wonderful trips out of it, and we had great fun. And there's no way you can work schedules like that with a people hauler, because those planes, people got to keep moving. And I also learned that no matter where you go, there's something interesting around. You could go to Terre Haute, Indiana, or whatever place we went to in North Dakota, or thinking of some town, Harlingen, Texas. But you can't sit in the motel, and just like in Southeast Asia, you can't sit on the air base if they let you out.
When did you end up here at St. George?
March of 1989. It's 36 years this month. Shopped everything from Panama City Beach to Shell Point, south of Tallahassee, and came down to this one. The house was 8 months old when I moved in. The guy who owned these properties had built it for his beach house, so it was made better. And came with a deal with him. Then he called me one time. I was saying, I'm going to call him and see if he'll sell me that lot. But I said, I'll wait a few days. He called me the next day himself and offered me the lot, which made a great balance on the asking price. And so that's mine too. I got a little elbow room that way because these houses are close together otherwise. But it was a couple of years before this house here was there. The big one out there was there. Nothing for a block and a half, 2 city blocks distance that way. None of that stuff out front was. I fought and lost a little legal battle on where the one out in front of us is, but the legal battle I was fighting was against the House Counsel for the Florida Trial Lawyers Association. I was a loser before I started. That's getting away from the subject, but I wanted water. I was bidding Puerto Rico with FedEx so I could get the hotel on the beach there and go windsurfing. And I said, why don't I live somewhere where I can windsurf? And I lived in Memphis. They got rid of a chief pilot who said, you can't jump seat into your work on a specific night. The new guy said, well, of course you can jump seat in. All you're doing is sitting there riding. He said, we're not going to put that on your working time. So, I can move somewhere else. And I've spent of that almost 20 years, 18 years of it, driving to Tallahassee, hopping on a jump seat on a FedEx plane at 9 in the evening, flying to work getting there maybe midnight or a little before, waiting a couple hours and starting my week's work. Free ride there, free ride back, every time. Never missed that seat. It was competition to get it, and I never missed it for all those years.
That's awesome.
And now I windsurfed out here for years, back when I could do it.
That's great.
I couldn't hold on anymore.
And you've stayed pretty involved in the veterans community here. You were volunteer for the highway patrol.
That was my big volunteer thing. Before I was in that, I did help some at the chili cook-off with just mundane tasks, but I was never a super island volunteer like some of the guys are. We've got, I don't know if he had any military or not. Mason Bean is a guy that does everything for everybody and sort of has the attitude like the general. And there's some really good volunteers around here, but I can't say I was one of them for the island part.
Yeah, well, I mean, Howard, so it's 20-something years with the highway patrol?
24, and that was pretty good. I kind of feel I did something there. It was putting a car out on the street for visibility, and I helped a lot of people. When you have a flat tire or a problem with your vehicle up Highway 65 or 67, particularly in the early days, even cell phones wouldn't work. You get much past the fire tower, old cell phones wouldn't have any signal at all. And that's when it was nice to help people. I've hauled people off to get gas and sometimes brought back gas to them, helped them get tires changed, had my radio to where I could call and get AAA service for them. And it was a rewarding job from that standpoint.
Have you, just thinking about community veterans organizations, service and all of that, have you seen the Three Soldiers Monument in Apalachicola? Is this something you're...
Yes, I've seen it, and of course been at events circled around, and I'm very impressed with that. And I was always impressed with the effort and time that Jimmy Mosconis put into that project and how effective he was in getting it here. And sometimes, I guess even I and a lot of other people probably forget the extent of importance that is. It's not just another casual statue.
No.
It's a rarity and something that easily could not have happened without a bunch of effort.
Was that the dedication? That was 2008.
When they actually did that, I did not attend that.
What is that monument or monuments like it? What does that mean to you as a Vietnam veteran? Do you have a kind of specific relationship with it?
Well, I'm impressed by the feeling of it. It doesn't, of course, get the total emotional effect that going to the large monument in D.C. does. I've never seen the half-scale traveling version of that, but I have been to D.C. and I just went with a little list and got some pictures that Connie took, and that gets to you. At first I wondered about, well, it's not a glorifying type monument, yet it's in a way even more effective than anything else could be. As I mentioned about when I graduated from pilot training, there were only a few single-seat fighters, and I was set back at my first class. A good friend of mine that I actually got into motorcycling also was number one, and he got an F-100. And he went through training in F-100, did just fine, got over to Bien Hoa Air Force Base, which was a 100 base in Vietnam, and I think lasted less than 15 minutes on his first mission. He was killed. And it was an accident, actually. His leader had engine failure on takeoff, which in an F-100 causes you to be very short of engines. And the guy managed to dump his ordnance in some safe spot that they kept very close to the base as he was circling. And apparently, a friend was coming up to eyeball him, see how he was doing, whether or not he's got a fire problem or whatever, and tried to stay with him coming around without dropping his ordnance load. And he went beyond the capabilities of the airplane at that speed with that weight, and snapped. And it was an error, but somewhat understandable in the situation, because his whole idea was to help the guy. But that's one of the names. It wasn't enemy fire, but it was because of being there in the war. So
yeah, and it's just fascinating to me to have a piece of that here.
yeah, it's a major memory thing, particularly for a community the size of Apalachicola and Franklin County, and frankly the whole Panhandle.
Well, as we kind of start to wrap up, a couple of questions you can kind of answer in any order. I'm thinking about advice you might have for future generations, future service members, and I'm wondering if you were to be talking to a classroom, it's like school children, what's something you would tell them about service, about mission? Take away.
I would say a career in the military service can be very good if you can end up finding a reason and way to like it. If it was, say, a class, I would say, if at all possible, and you've got the interest and aptitude, stay in school as long as you can, because if you can get that bachelor's degree, that gives you an option to do tasks in the military that are that much more interesting and responsible as an officer. But if academics aren't your big interest, and you don't mind being in a situation where you work with a lot of people, the enlisted side of the services can be very good also, and it can give you a chance to build a career where you can prepare for a change of life later, but still have a livable income to do it with. The idea of being forced into retirement because of your age and time in service is also an opportunity, as well as a limit on how long you can do something. And say, for anybody that can find any direction within that system that they think they could enjoy, give it a try. It's obviously not for everybody, but some people know it ahead of time.
Is there anything we haven't covered in this interview that you'd like to share?
I think I babbled so much it probably covers most of it. I think some people might feel that their lives are more restricted than it really is to be in the military, and that I think I can show you still can go out and do other things with your life and still participate the way you're supposed to. I had a hobby that was pretty much unrelated to the military and motorcycle racing, but I was doing it with accredited associations, and it was all considered line of duty, and I never hid it from any commander and didn't have to. So it doesn't shut you out from doing stuff you might like on the side, other than physical location. And so you can have a military life and a life at the same time. And people with families, I think they offer them a number of opportunities. In the early years, I think it can be financially tough for families, particularly enlisted families, So you do have to be prepared for that. But don't ever throw out the thought of doing it.
Well, that's all I have.
Okay, I know I've babbled on forever about some of the stuff, but
Fascinating.
I
But thank you for your time today, and thank you for your service as well.
oh, thank you. I've enjoyed this.
Me as well. Me as well. You've been great.